We're live. Cool.
All right.
Right. Welcome, Matt. How are you?
Good. I'm good.
Great. Great. How was last week?
It's good. I've been working really hard on the novel, putting out an outline for myself, kind of separating. I mean, this is a kind of good conversation because I mean, it really shows how this Marxist stuff can help us not only understand kind of the economic sphere, but actually help us carry out our projects. Because if you really think about Marxism, this idea of as a science, we're thinking about not just the bourgeois and the proletariat, but actually like how the world works, right? So my writing, I was able to separate narration and dialogue and see if this is like one is like synthesis, and the other is one is thesis, one is antithesis, and one is a combination. It's really true. If you can look at anything, right, and instead of looking at it as a thing, look at it as a combination of things, you can begin to understand the thing, right? So I don't know much about cars, but if I were to look at a car and say, okay, well, there's a body of a car, there's an engine of a car, there's the upholstery of the car, there's the trunk of the car, so I was going to begin to understand the various components of a car, even though I don't know much about cars. Even though I look at a car and I think I don't know anything about cars, right? That's my immediate thought. I don't know how cars work, right? If I can start to think about it in its different parts, and the different parts and how those different parts interact, I begin to understand cars. Right now, it doesn't make me an engineer. That doesn't make me a car builder. That doesn't make me a mechanic. But I'd be able to understand cars more clearly than I did 10 minutes prior, right?
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with learning about cars. It has everything to do with experience using a Marxist approach to reality, right? I just begin to break things down to the component parts. So I'm looking at this novel, and I'm like, how do I write a novel? And I know how to write poems, but how do I write a novel? Well, I don't know. So I started thinking about the novel and its component parts. And I begin to break them apart, separate them, so I can put them back together.
Yeah.
So the ability to kind of reverse engineer, you really begin to develop your ability to reverse engineer when you study Marx. I mean, it really helps. It really just trains your mind at how to take things about their component parts and then put them back together. So I've been going about the business of writing a novel in a very Marxian kind of way. That's what I've been up to.
Well, it's good to know. We're looking forward to this work. What do you, without getting into, without letting the cat out of the bag before you should, do you have a title for the book?
Yeah, I think I need to until I get all the copyrights and all that stuff like that. I should probably refrain from doing too much of that. But I can tell you a little bit about it. I mean, it's a speculative novel, meaning science fiction. That's the new term, speculative. Yeah. Speculative fiction. And it's set in a future where the country is no longer America. It's a different country now, and it's it is full of all these kind of weird tropes, and it's a world that's very different from ours. It's set in a future that's much more highly automated, but the political structures and the political systems and the political ideologies that hover are very similar to ours, right? Mm. And you see these people in these different conditions, and you see them accepting a series of arbitrary norms. And you're watching it thinking what's wrong with these people? But those arbitrary norms are similar enough to the arbitrary norms of today that the ultimate point is no, not what's wrong with them. What's wrong with you? That's what the slow unravel is that wait a minute, and there's no, it's not like Twilight Zone where it's it's a cookbook or Planet of the Apes, where comedy sees the statue you damn fools. So there's nothing like that. There's no dramatic reveal like that, the whole time. But it's a slow, more painful burn to realize that, oh no, this world is different, but this world is the same. And so that's what the novel's about. Yeah.
Well, we're looking forward to it. I think that it's a good way to get started with our conversation today because Well, there's some elements, as you say in your, I'll give myself a little bit of license here, in your Marxian production of this novel.
Yeah.
Right? You pay attention to things and will compel readers to recognize things that they often misrecognize, so that in a very Marxian tradition, you lay the facts, so that they may be weighed, not in relation to the protagonists and the antagonists, if you will, of the narration, but in relation to ourselves as either protagonists or antagonists. I want to welcome folks to today's discussion, and I'd like to begin this discussion with attention to two concepts that I draw from my understanding of Marx's literary style. Since we're talking, it's interesting that we're talking about that we began our discussion this morning with a discussion of your literary work, and I'd like to also then pay attention a little bit to, in fact, give not more than just a little bit, give some substance, some substantive attention to Marx's literary style, and I'd like to do so by sharing with folks that as I was reading chapter 19, and as I read its first sentence, and I'll talk about the first sentence in a little bit, as I read its first sentence, I was struck by his use of the word appears in that first sentence. And it's a word that Marx often uses throughout this book to note a distinction between what is perceived, right? And then, of course, what is really there, right? And the interruptions between reality and perception that he is attempting to disclose. His mapping, if you will, of history, his mapping of the economy, and ultimately his mapping of society is one that requires, this distinction, requires that this distinction be made, understood, etc. And so, as I've been reading this book, of course, I've been struck by his use of the word appears, and also I've come to understand that there is this position that he takes. Certainly, I understand it a lot better now than I had before, especially after having read chapter 18, where he critiques conventional discussions of profit and surplus value, and then a corresponding discussion of surplus labor. I am really interested in this distinction that he makes implicitly between staticity, stillness, if you will, on the one side, and motion on the other side. To the extent that he critiques, when he doesn't build upon, to the extent that he critiques the work of Adam Smith and the work of Ricardo and other political economists, as he identifies them, he frames their work within this first concept of staticity. And then, of course, he positions himself as a critic of these political economists. He positions himself as a historical economist, given his understanding of the motion of things, the science of things, the mechanics of things, right? To draw from something that you had said earlier about, the mechanisms of this thing we call a car and its function in society. So what I'd like to do first, Matt, is I'd like to talk about staticity. I'd like to talk about staticity so that we can then talk about motion, and then we can then talk about Marx's, the substance of chapter 19, to move away from his literary techniques and then draw attention to the words on the page. In staticity, we would see ourselves, or staticity, and the proponents of staticity, right, would compel us to see ourselves encapsulated and believe, and having us believe that everything else is itself encapsulated. That is, that this understanding is pleasant when it doesn't compel us to conformity. When we seek peace as permanence, for instance, the good old days when America, as it were, was great. Thus, those who have contained society are concerned to impose this epistemology and normalize it. How else, for instance, could the seeming permanence of what was, of what is, and what will be, a phrase drawn from my religious upbringing, Matt, how else could this phrase, right, be perceived in the face of terrible oppression? In other words, those who are proponents of a static way of understanding the world, those who are proponents of our staticity, our encapsulation, and then of course our understanding that the world is entirely encapsulated, segmented and separated from everything else, right? Need for us to see the world in such a way and to understand that the world functions in that way, so that we can be controlled, that we can be contained, that we can be divided, and that of course they can take our understandings all the way to the bank. Before I get into a discussion of this other trope, or this other understanding, this other philosophical orientation, motion, Matt, I'd like to talk about, I'd like to see what your thoughts are on this question of
Well, I remember in 2000, and I think it was 13 or 14, I saw this picture of three different pictures of people wearing three different outfits, right? It was one picture with three people wearing different outfits, and the idea was that to imply that things don't change, right? And it was three African Americans, and one was dressed as a slave, one was dressed as someone that was experiencing like a chain gang or Jim Crow or something like that, and one was dressed as a prisoner, an orange jumpsuit, right? And so the idea was that things don't change, right? That America is constantly oppressing Black people, and it just does not change. Unending, unbending, just a conveyor belt of cruelty, right?
Yeah.
Oppression. But the reality is, all three things of these are different. Those are all different from each other. Now, what's static is that people are being oppressed. What is static is the oppression of black people in America. That is what's static. What is changing is the form that it's taking, right? So, because slavery is different than Jim Crow, and it is different than a prison industrial system. And when I say it's different, I don't mean it's any better. I just mean it's different. It is different. If you look at when you look at like someone who's being enslaved and in the period of slavery, you're looking at a period of time where the South was actually the economically dominant portion of the country, and the North is an adjunct of the South. The North is something that grows out of the South in order to get the product of the South into the world market. When you look at Jim Crow, now you're looking at a time where the North has now become what is called the North becomes the dominant feature of the country, and they are more than the South becomes a feeder into the North.
Yeah.
And the North is looking to expand west, and that's where all these cities are being developed in what is now called the Midwest. So that time period where that happens, that's happening, and then later into the Sun Belt, right? So that is what's actually happening at that time period. Then you look at today, when you look at a prison industrial complex, now you're looking at a system that's incorporating a massive amount of people that is disproportionately Black, but not solely Black. And so you're looking at three different things in three different time periods, And there's a constant, and that constant is the position, the relative position of Black Americans in the country. But what is different is the actual form that this thing takes, right? So we can look at that. We can look at. I'm just picking out this one picture I saw that was supposed to illustrate that things don't change, but actually illustrates that things do change, and they don't change, right? So we can do the similar thing with with the Chicanos. We can do some things with various groups in the United States of America to look at, okay, this is the form it takes here, this is the form it takes here, this is the form it takes here. But things are constantly changing. There's always change going on, and that change is based upon. I mean, I would say that the greatest driver of change is actually the technological base. When the technological base changes, it forces changes in the political structure, it forces changes in cultural production, it forces changes in what's called, kind of the superstructure, right? Yeah. Which is religious doctrine, which is television, or some, the equivalent of that, popular entertainment, newspapers, all kinds of like that. Those are all going to shift, and they're going to shift slightly to really report the news of the day, or to the doctrine, to develop the doctrine of the day, which is going to correspond to whatever the technological base has changed to. And so that's how the system maintains itself. That's how it keeps different peoples in different subordinate positions, whether we're talking about the general proletariat or whether you're talking about specific groups of people who have been conquered and colonized and pulled into this imperial economic system. It's going to be based on the changes that take place, because things do change.
Yeah.
But positions don't, unless there's a war. I mean, unless there's some kind of overthrowing of whatever the general position of people, they don't really change.
Explains civil wars. It explains civil rights movements. Always, opposition, contrapositions, contestations, and confrontations in society, right?
So the civil rights movement, as we understand it, right, or as it took place. I mean, it was not to say the fight for civil rights, or the fight for or human rights, or the fight to be free, or the fight to have some dignity. Yeah. I mean, that you had those fights were going on in the 1800s too. I mean, yeah. Those fights are going on in the 1700s. I mean, you have your rebellions, you have all kinds of things. The fights for all these fights begin, as soon as the oppression begins. You have slave rebellions, you have native raids, you have all kinds of things going on in like the 1600s. I mean, so the fight begins the minute the fighting starts. But the civil rights, as we understand it, all these different things where we have these differently highly racialized groups fighting to get into an economic system. That fight can only occur with the economic expansion, with the United States becoming the predominant power amongst the earth, with things like the GI Bill, with things like with which was initially designed only to help white people, and in a way almost specifically a hand up to what were called white ethnics, like kind of like it was way, that all these different groups who had previously been locked out of certain things here and there and separated here and there, because you couldn't get elected because an Irishman can't get a job in this town, a Greek can't get elected city council, blah 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 blah. So you got the GI Bill that actually kind of like helps break up a lot of that, and actually allows people to just, if you come, that allows the division of the melting pot of all the races of Europe, burning into one crucible, all that kind of stuff in the early 1900s. The GI Bill actually makes a lot of that real, right? So then you have that, but at the same time, you have all these people locked out of it, right? And who are the people locked out of it? Well, these are the people who are the victims of stolen land and stolen lives, right? So this is, this is Black people, this is the Chicanos, the Mexicans, this is Native Americans, this is all the people who were really kind of the principal victims of the last 500 years, like this thing. So what? So how do they get into that system? How do they fight to get out? How do they become a part of that expanding economy? right? Well, that defines much of the civil rights movement, this idea to get in, this integrational push in, right? Now, of course, at the same time, you have all kinds of people saying, like, no, we shouldn't integrate the system, hell with this system, we need to overthrow this system, da 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 da, da, right? That's great, and that's the kind of stuff we remember, and that's the kind of stuff we want to like champion and cherish and be like, that's great. That's not the primary character of what happened between, like, let's say 1950 and 1975. You know, that's not really what happened. I mean, what really happened is the primary push was everyday people wanting a fairer shake. That is the majority of what happened, and whether you want to like condemn that, whether you want to say, you know, like applaud that, whether you want to have some middle opinion about that, that is what happened. Like, that is what happened. So like that objectively is what happened. So, but the basis for that happening exists outside of the will of the individuals. That exists outside of, like, you know, the people and what they want. That exists outside of them fighting, because they were fighting before that.
It,
you know, they were fighting before that.
Yeah,
like before they were still fighting.
It's the
so the fight too.
That discussion, or that conclusion that you just, or that, you know, that preliminary conclusion that you provide in this moment is the basis, is basic to Marx's historical materialist understanding, right? That you know, people are in opposition with one another, contesting one another, and that the different methods, the different systems by which one attempts to subvert the other within society, within history, right, is the basis for the development of capitalism. And this very discussion, this very understanding, this vision is grounded, if you will, as I'm coming to understand it in this particular book, in Kapital, is grounded in Marx's attention to motion, to movement, to the forces of nature itself, right? And we see then, as Marx draws attention to this concept of motion, however implicitly, we see that everything is constantly in flux, in opposition, confrontation, contradiction, and is transformed by these things. This understanding is contentious and obliges us, those of us who are reading Kapital, obliges us to recognize the ever-present reality of society's fit within a network of confrontations that society itself might harness at some point in the future, but that in the moment harnesses society, right? This explains the historical grounding in Marx's social and economic science, where his attention to the proverbial elephant in the room, i.e. the development of the methods, means, and conditions of modern capitalist industrial relations, requires a distancing, a fracture, with encapsulated and encapsulating ways of thinking. Here then is Marx's coupling by way of Kapital, the book itself in this case, of historiography and historicity. It's his towel in the ring of history, right? That is, it's his mapping of capital's rise, of its development, and however elusive its transformation. That this book is itself Marx's hat in the ring, I should have said, right? Thus, after his political involvement in mid-19th century European history, is it that he targets the dominion of the priests, of the very economy that has since become hegemonic, right? And so, of course, now I'm talking about Ricardo and Adam Smith and some of these other people that he cites in these recent chapters of our reading. And so Marx's tactful use of the word appears to signal the charade and society's subsumption. And so chapter 19 is a critique of the obfuscations, of the distractions, of the confusions about wages, as chapter 18 was about surplus value. Consider then the first line of the chapter. On the surface of bourgeois society, the wage of the laborer appears as the price of labor, a certain quantity of money that is paid for a certain quantity of labor. I'd like to turn to my notes and preparations. Anyway, the distinction is determined, the distinction that he's making, right, or that he's about to make in chapter 19, is determined by the fact that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor within it, then the value of 12 hours of labor cannot be determined by itself as labor, but on the basis of something else. In other words, where classical economy, classical political economists, right, determined that the price of labor was couched in its value, right? We know, on account of the fact that labor is a commodity, much as this is a commodity, that we know that it's the product, that its value is a consequence of things external to it, of things that exist in history. You know, at this point, of course, we've read as far as labor as a commodity, we know, and other commodities, we know that labor is a social product, that it's a form of the material relations of individuals, that it produces use values and exchange values. We know that labor is an exercise of muscle, nerve, and brain. And this, for me, is especially significant given my attention to the question of socialization within educational institutions. We know that labor might be divided between necessary labor and surplus labor, and we know that these things are constitutive, right? Are held and contained in this thing that we call surplus value. These are some of the things that we've been reading so far throughout the various months that we've been reading this book. And we also know about labor, right? That first it is formally subjected, right? And that this is then followed by a real subjection. In other words, that there are material and ideological things taking place, much as things are taking place in this vehicle that you were talking about at the outset of our conversation, right? That coalesce, converge in this movement, in this motion that we call labor. Conventional political economists, conventional understandings of what takes place nowadays, I suppose we might say between 9 and 5. Of course, you know, this is no longer as true as it was 50 years ago. But in any case, we know that a series of things have taken place in history such that the motion that is taking place within this thing called labor is a product of things outside of the moment, and that these things outside of the moment determine, right, the value of labor. I'd like to talk about.
Before you move on, though, I mean, I really think that is a really important point here, because the what labor you do is determined by what labor is by the world you find yourself in. I mean, and you tend to have this idea that you are this thing, right? But this thing exists. You have taken on a skill to operate machines that exist. You know what I'm saying? You are not floating in the universe a bus driver. You drive buses because buses exist, and that opportunity was available. Right? And there was a time when buses didn't exist.
Yeah.
And there may come a time where the role of bus driver does not exist because buses no longer require drivers. Right? So you can't think of yourself in terms of these skills and things that you've taken on. I mean, you are those things, but you are those things locked in time. It's not like you would have been a bus driver, and like, I'm a bus driver today, and I would have been a bus driver in 1650. You know, no, you wouldn't have. Like, you know, you wouldn't have. And you won't be a bus driver, and in the same way that you wouldn't have been a bus driver in 1650, you won't be a bus driver in 2130. You know what I'm saying? You have to, and like you're not gonna live that long, but I mean, but the point is the point is that you can't conceive of yourself. You can't conceive of yourself as these positions, because these positions exist independent of you.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? Those positions in society exist whether or not you were born. So it's not like you are, and they will leave whether or not you need them there, on the basis again, on the basis of technology. So these things are going to, like, Spartacus never organized a factory strike. There's no factories, right? So the idea of fighting, that all there is the fight. So I mean, like, Karl Marx says that the motivation in history is a class struggle or something like that. Well, he's also a propagandist. He's also saying things to get people excited. He's not saying everything to technically be true, right? Because that's technically not true. The motive engine of history is the motive engine. It is the engine. It is the the cotton engine. It is the steam engine. It is the microchip. It is all these different things that reshape society around them, right? It is the plow. It is all these things that end up creating fields of labor. But fields of labor come and go with the tools that are being employed. So I think that's really important when you're talking about that labor question. Those whole fields of labor can disappear. And fields of connected labor to that labor can disappear on the basis of these things.
So I think that if we are to understand this, right, then of course we need to understand that there's this thing called labor, and then there's this other thing called labor power, right? That when we understand, right, that it's labor power that is consumed by capital, that it's labor power that is exploited by capital, right? Then we also understand, right, that it's labor power that is brought to the market and not labor itself. That is, because labor, of course, is that which takes place in this moment, in the segmented, encapsulated moment, right? Or in this moment that we think is encapsulated from other moments, right? But it's labor power that is brought to the market. And so in keeping with your discussion about the bus driver, right? It's our capacities to do whatever it is that we're going to do to make a living that is brought to the market, right? It's not us as the bus driver that is brought to the market. We are schooled and socialized to perceive ourselves as such, but really, objectively, something else is taking place. Because, of course, as you mentioned, right, before there was, there was a moment in time when we couldn't have been a bus driver because buses simply didn't exist.
Yeah, right.
So it's labor that is brought. It's not ourselves as laborers that is brought to the market, but rather it is ourselves as containers of labor power that is inserted in a historical moment, right? That is, the object of exploitation and extraction.
Right. So put more, So put it into kind of kinetic terms, right? So this weekend, there was a boxing match between this guy Ryan Garcia and Luke Campbell, right? So the labor power that they sold was their ability to labor, right? And that's why they got paid the purses they got paid, right? That was their labor power. The actual act of labor was them punching each other in the face, right? So that was that. So you can see that was the labor in action, right? That's the labor. The labor power was the ability. I because I'm doing this. This is the value of my labor. This many eyes are going to be on me. That's the labor power. The labor in action is that. So similarly, a factory worker, I can make 20 widgets in half an hour, right? And the average person can only do 15. So okay, well, great. That sounds great. You're hired, right? Okay. So because I can do 20, I want this much money. Well, no. You want to haggle, right? You're haggling over your labor power, right? Your ability to do something. That's what you're selling. You're selling your ability. You're not actually selling the doing of it. Once you are in motion, then you're like putting that, and your labor is what you're imbuing into the product itself, what you're imbuing into the commodity. Your labor power is like what you tell someone that you can. This is how the hiring process, how you get actually hired. like your ability to do the thing. So I think that is that's the really important distinction. I think actually Engels, one of the things he did when he was trying to like edit and do some things with Marx's posthumous work was to go in to a lot of his work and kind of correct the places where Marx said labor when he meant labor power. I mean, this is kind of interesting because this was something that Marx kind of didn't come up with and then write it. It was something he came up with while writing. You know what I'm saying? So like you actually see things where Marx says labor instead of labor power. In fact, you see it in this chapter. In this chapter, he says labor when I'm pretty sure he meant labor power. Because he talks about selling your labor, which I'm pretty sure he meant labor power, just like it's a typo, right? But that's in this chapter where he says, I think he says near the beginning, like, what is the value of the labor appears, speaking of labor, I don't know, it's in the first 3 paragraphs. He talks about selling your labor. Yeah. I'm pretty sure he meant labor power, but
yeah,
I don't know, the book's like 800 pages, so it's gonna have
yeah. I mean, you got to give him some slack every night.
Of course, but I'm pretty sure that he meant labor power in this instance. Yeah. So again, this is a really, really important distinction, the distinction between labor and labor power. And it seems very arbitrary when you hear it. It seems really arbitrary, like what the hell are you talking about? But it's kind of like a mathematical error. If you make that mathematical error early on the chalkboard, it's going to appear much later down the road. So making that distinction when you're talking about labor and when you're talking about labor power, it's really, really important because the error will show up as you're coming to further and further conclusions if you started from the wrong place.
Well, it is in his discussion of the aggregate labor contained in the worker as a commodity that the value of the worker is determined. The value of labor power is determined, he writes, by the labor time necessary for the production and the reproduction of this special article. Therefore, the labor time requisite for the production of labor, I should note that this is drawn from a previous chapter, right? Because as I was getting ready for today's discussion, I went to other places where he had addressed this concept of labor as a commodity and drew from it in order to make sense of the things that he's talking about here in chapter 19. So I turned to an earlier reading from an earlier chapter. At the moment, I forget the name. I forget the actual chapter number. But in any case, this quote is drawn from this, and I'd like to use this quote as a bridge to talk about something that I'll talk about in just as soon as I'm done with the quote. The value of labor power is determined by the labor time necessary for the production and the reproduction of this special article. Therefore, the labor time requisite for the production of labor power reduces itself to that necessary for the production of those means of subsistence. In other words, the value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the laborer, right? So that if we are to understand the obfuscation of value of labor by way of this discussion of wages, right? We need to understand then that there's a series of things that are taking place before this person shows up to the factory human resources place, right? Wherever it is that the worker or the laborer, I should say, submits his or her application documents, right? There's a series of things that takes place that capacitate this particular laborer in particular ways that conform and are consistent with his insertion or her insertion in the hierarchy of the organization where this particular person is seeking employment, such that somebody might arrive at a university, for instance, either with a degree from a university, or might arrive at the university with a diploma from a high school, seeking insertion in this particular knowledge factory in a particular echelon, right? And that the value is the value of that labor, the value of that labor is determined then by the laborer's preparation, training, and and quote unquote objective evaluations of his or her capacities when or when that person arrives at the learning factory.
Yeah. Well,
This, this
but again, it is.
Let me just finish this part right here, and then I'll turn it over to you. This recognition of the potential abilities of brain, nerve, and muscle in laborers is in fact what must be understood in order to avert ascriptions, because this is really what I want to get at, right? That there's this set of things that are taking place that would avert our attention from what's actually and objectively taking place, and that Marx is laying his attention to, and that is this recognition of the potential abilities of brain, nerve, and muscle in laborers is in fact what must be understood in order to avert ascriptions to conventional logic, to ahistoric logic in classical political economy, a logic that does not fit commodity production in a socio-historic framework whose methods, means, and conditions are determining factors. Marx writes elusively, before I turn it over to you, Marx writes elusively, what economists therefore call value of labor is in fact labor power, as it exists in the personality of the laborer, which is as different from its function, labor, as a machine is from the work it performs, as the bus is, right, from the from the work it performs. Go ahead.
When it comes to universities, it's all a question of how well do you sell your story, like how well do you sell things, like how well do you sell your position, because you can weaponize coming, or not weaponize. I should say, well, man, well, fuck it. You can weaponize. You can use a weapon against system. A story of unconventionality. I shouldn't be here. I'm, an ex-con. I shouldn't be here. I'm 60 years old. I shouldn't be here. I'm only 14, but I'm a child prodigy. And all those, your ability to do the work, your ability to write these essays, your ability to analyze this information, all that stuff is one thing. But like on those applications, what they're really looking for is this like story you can tell them that tickles their fancy. I mean, it's so arbitrary as to like why one person will be admitted to the school and won't be there. In the same way, the job market, it is arbitrary as to why you will be hired or not hired. The arbitrary nature of these things is all about selling yourself and telling a story which you share with millions of people who've gone through similar kind of little experiential things, right? But you just sold it better. You told it better. You made it more interesting. You told me a story, and instead of thinking about myself, instead of thinking about you, I started thinking about myself. I started thinking about my kids. I started thinking about my nephew. I started thinking about blah, 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 and I decided to hire you. I started thinking about something else. It touched my heart. I decided to admit you to this college. But that's the way the world works. It's not just the series of things you're talking about. It's the ability of the individual to what? To sell their labor power, to sell their student learning power, to sell whatever it may be to get into the things. But I was really, really interested in what we earlier were talking about this thing about the labor power inside of the worker, right? But that labor power is not inherent. It's not innate in the worker. They have to learn that somewhere, right? And that goes to the social reproduction of the worker. And so that is the field you're in, which is that you are training labor power. You are training people to have a skill set, which that skill set is their labor power, or their ability,
maybe.
Right? I mean, that's what it is. I mean, like this idea of like, people talk about a school to prison pipeline and everyone freaks out about it. And that's right. It's right that people should be freaked out. That's wrong. That's a horrible thing. That people are being just, shot into prison. That's terrible. But the fact of the matter is school's always been a pipeline. It was never this beautiful paradise. It was never this beautiful, wonderful thing that existed for the betterment of the individual and for the raising of children and for some kind of patriotic thing where you put your hand over your heart. No, school's always been a pipeline. It was a pipeline to a factory. It was a pipeline to a mechanic's job. It was a pipeline to whatever. It was a pipeline to Harvard. It was a pipeline to this. It was a pipeline to the suites and the executives. What depends on the school. But every school is a pipeline. Harvard is a pipeline. Everything is a pipeline to something else. That is what education is. It is a pipeline to something else. And we have to really understand that. We have to be very clear about that. And the destination of the pipeline obviously would increase the urgency of needing to fight it, right? Because like where you're headed obviously makes the situation more urgent. In the same way, like I have a stomach flu versus like I got shot in the leg, right? Okay, well, one's more urgent than the other, right? But like the fact of the matter is, for both reasons, I need to go to the hospital. I need to go see a doctor, right? Either way, and so like that, so it's a pipeline. Either way, it's not. We need to restructure society. But the other thing I wanted to really want to get on before I forget is we're talking about necessary labor. Now, if I were to tell you, okay, the floor needs to be mopped, the necessary labor is, I don't know, maybe 12 hours. Like it's a giant floor. Let's change that because it's too confusing already. The floor needs to be mopped. The necessary labor is 30 minutes or something like that. In everyday vernacular English, you would think that what I'm saying is that it takes me 30 minutes to mop the floor.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what that sounds like. So that's what we have to really be careful with when we're reading Marx, is not to, we have to understand how Marx defines terms, because some of it goes against the way that we talk, right? So necessary labor is not the time it requires to make this pen. That's not necessary labor. Necessary labor is something different.
Exactly.
Necessary labor is about like, okay, what wages will I be compensated that I need to survive? That's what necessary labor is, and then what's above that is a surplus labor, and that's what's being skimmed out of me to make profit. But so we have to really understand that. So we have to, and necessary labor is just one example. There's a couple different examples where Marx uses his terminology that goes against the grain of how we talk. Maybe people talk differently back then. Maybe he's just a contrarian who likes to make up his own. Who knows? But we have to. I remember when I first started reading Marx, he was talking about necessary labor, and I didn't think to think, oh, this is whatever. Like I should think about how he's using this. I just thought about the way like the way we talk, right? So I figured like, oh, that's how long it takes to make a pen, or that's how long it takes to make a notebook. Like, no, that's not what it means. So there's a couple terms like that we got to be wary of.
Well, the thing is that his use of such terms, and of course his use of such terms is, number one, couched in definitions of the terms that he provides in earlier chapters of the book, and his use of such terms, right, is also couched in a larger historical framework, in a historical materialist framework, right, such that the term is attentive not to the encapsulated moment, or to what is perceived to be an encapsulated movement in his time, 12 hours of work or 16 hours of work. In our time, perhaps 12 hours of work, or what have you, right? But that the term is used to understand that motion, that movement, that exploitation, that labor that's taking place and that exists within a larger context outside of the workday, and that, as you note, right, is a fraction, is a portion, is a percentage of the work that is exercised by the laborer in order to feed herself for the day, and is used to distinguish another portion of the labor that is exercised and that is drawn from capital in order to create value for the exchanges that the capitalist is going to bring to market as a consequence of one's work. Thus, to reduce wages to price, right, as is done in classical political economy, extinguishes every trace of the division of the working day into necessary labor and surplus labor, into paid and unpaid labor, where the pre-capitalist slave labor is honest about its theft of labor. In wage labor, even surplus labor, which is stolen from labor, appears as paid. Right. This is drawn from a particular quote. I'm thinking about at this moment, Matt. I'm thinking about something that you had said earlier, that we need to pay attention to the language in the book, either because the language of 19th century, of the 19th century is different from our use of language today, or the possibility that Marx was, as you put it, I think you meant it somewhat tongue-in-cheek, a contrarian. And I'm really caught by that contemplation, as it were, because Marx was, as I've come to understand by way of reading this book, and of course I've read a couple biographies of him, he was sometimes he was, if he wasn't suspicious about people, he was cynical about people. Certainly he was critical about people, and so he positioned himself and drew from conventional language about people in society. At the moment, particular phrases escape my memory, but in any case, he used conventional, even popular language to critique other people. In a sense, he certainly was a contrarian, right?
Yeah.
But he was a contrarian because he was seeking to spur us. He was a propagandist, as you said earlier, and so he's seeking to compel us to recognize what we often misrecognize, because conventional logic, conventional understandings, popular language keep popular language contained and controlled as it is by the priests of language and by priests themselves, right, is keeping us from seeing what is scientific, what can be scientifically and historically determined.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I mean, this chapter is very much about, kind of the illusions of labor, and how people, the illusions of economists, right? And that are purposely put in our way to misrecognize, misunderstand what we have in front of us, the world as it is. But I mean, he's also writing about like how even without these misreadings and these intentional misleadings, that you would still not understand the world in front of you if you just looked at it, because you can't understand things if you don't know their origin points, and you don't know their history, you don't know their component parts. You can't, like earlier we were talking about a car. I can't understand the car simply by looking at the car, and thinking like, okay, I know how to operate the car. I put the key in, I turn it on. Well, me knowing how to turn on the car and drive the car to the destination is not me understanding how a car works, right? So to understand how the car works, I would need to understand its component parts, right? Now imagine I'm looking at this car, I'm getting ready to drive this car and start this car, and there's a whole society telling me that engines don't exist, that there's no such thing as an engine. Don't open the hood. Don't even look. There's no engine. Engines are a myth.
Yeah.
Car loves you. I mean, like, that's what I'm saying? Well, that's how we are in society. That's how we operate within society.
Yeah.
Don't lift the hood. Don't look under the hood. Just drive the car. Go to work. Don't ask questions. Right? And so we see
it reminds
and we see the car. We see the freeway.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of my constant admonishment of my kids as they were growing up. They were enamored. I mean, this might be a bit removed from our discussion, but it reminds me nevertheless of my admonishment that they learn to use a map as opposed to turning to Google Maps, right? Because with a map, on paper, one can identify the parameters in which one finds oneself, and then navigate within those particular parameters. Technology's imposition of what you call, don't even look under the map, just get in the car, turn it on, and go to wherever it is you're going to go, right? Society's imposition of this way of thinking is what facilitates our misrecognition of the fact that we exist in space, we exist in time, right? And if we're not careful, we're going to exist in time and in space in ways that are profitable for other people, in ways that are exploitative for us, right? So absolutely, absolutely, I'm in agreement with you. I think that you're making a very important observation here. We're at the end of our discussion. Oh, that went quick. That went quick.
All right. Well, Garai says a mechanic understands what we get bamboozled. Very much so. Very much so. All right. All right. Since we had a whole show about misrecognition, here's a poem about misrecognition. It's called Wagon's Threat. Through pavement, the citizen civilian of conquest pouring little products into little boxes where buffalo once danced and humans once being, now citizens civilized, fed, but not free, now pay toll to pavement, littered, glittering strip malls and city lights, monuments and copyright, anthems and allegiance, denial and disconnect. The threat is not external but stitched to the wagon's thread to nightmare. It's a national skin, a house on a hill, a home on a range. Call it safe. Raise a flag. Load a gun. Build a gate. The blood on our hands, the scars on our backs, our minds alone, prisoners of a past that has not yet passed, and everywhere there is war. Wall glyphs, made liberty. Dust kicks, manifest destiny, picket fence, white flight in the model minority. The suburbs are a dream within a dream within a dream. An America within America, within America's feet, the apartments above you, rolling hills of privilege. Been a long time since those rabbits chased after carrots. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of inheritance. But deep down, you know these colors do run and the paint does crack. And though it may be a long way down, it's just a short road back. So work yourself to ulcer at the altar of appearances. You earn this, deserve this, make religion of it more than a conqueror. You're born to be prosperous, shining, and magnificent. You are the Joneses. Now circle this wagon, protect this force, rally for safer communities, Recipe 1070, for minimum sentencing, for Prop 187, for gang injunction, for 3-strike law, for neighborhood watch, for stand your ground, stand over graveyards and shock and awe through blood and dust, through steel and rust of what we become, where we have been, of what we are born. Little products from our little boxes filtered through all the news fit to print, blissful and ignorant. Now stay in tune with the television set. Vote against Willie Horton, vote against legal immigrant, vote against teachers union, vote against your own self-interest. This will keep you safe. Race and illusion, state and confusion, frontiers are not freedom, but forces of prison. The air is toxic, the water is poison, the suburbs are filled with asbestos. This is not good for you. This has made you hateful. This house, the cage fever, night terror, the bloody drone, the rising smoke, the ocean white with foam, far and safe from anywhere, where lit night sky tears flesh from bone. America, the only home I've ever known. 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 Everywhere the flag is flown, there is war.
Wow. Wow. The exposure, exposing things that we don't pay attention to, you know. Yeah, yeah. Our dreams, our ambitions, our aspirations. Maybe we shouldn't use the pronoun our to talk about them, you know. And anyway, your poem is making me think about these things because these dreams, the picket fence, is a fabrication and it exists in time. Is a fabrication of an idea that precedes our existence, and tomorrow, when trees no longer exist, when the last tree in the forest has been destroyed, you know, the picket fence won't be a thing. You know, it won't even be a dream. Wow. Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
All right. Anyway, so I'll
kind of glum.
poem drops a bomb, you know, the poem drop. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll talk soon. And we'll see you next week. Next week, chapter 20. And by the way, I think we have about 7 chapters left. So, you know, we're at the tail end. We're at the tail end.
Ease on out. All right.
All right. Perfect. Thanks a lot.